Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to 2020 State of the Economy versus State of the panel discussion. Today's event is organized by the Institute of Real Estate Management's Central Virginia Chapter 38. The Institute, also called IREM, is an international nonprofit organization formed with the purpose of establishing ethical standards in the real estate management industry and providing continuing education to our members. Today's panel discussion is being presented by our title sponsor, Colliers International. Colliers is a leading real estate professional services and investment management company employing over 18,000 individuals in over 68 countries with over 2 billion square feet of properties managed and completing over $129 billion in transactional value. We thank Colliers and their generosity and support, as this could not have happened without them. My name is Brandon Lewis of Colliers, and I will act as your host for today's event. This event, founded in 2016, was created for the purpose of sharing expert knowledge from multiple businesses and political arenas for experienced business professionals. These experts, formed in a panel discussion format, will discuss hot topics and politics, driving factors in the economy to help illustrate where we are and where we think we are headed. This event has become a signature event each year for IREM, with coverage from multiple media outlets such as the Richmond Times-Dispatch and Virginia Business. While normally this is a live event, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, IREM elected to take this event virtual for everyone's safety. Taking this event virtual was no easy task, and we could not have done this without the hard work and dedication of our event committee. I would like to take a brief moment to recognize each of them. Carrie Woodring of the Virginia Tech Foundation, Megan Bryant of the Virginia Housing Development Authority, Jamie Varon of Parkway Properties, Will Allen of Harper & Associates, Bruce Boykin of the James Center, Zach Price of Colliers International, Nicole Chappell of IREM, Sean Davis of Square Foot Property Group, Kim Mullins of the Virginia Tech Foundation, and of course, Robin Chamberlain of Colliers International and our 2020 IREM Chapter 38 president. Thank you all again for all of your hard work. This could not have happened without any of you. Additionally, we would like to take this moment to thank our event sponsors for their support in making this happen today. Rupert Landscape, Tolly Electrical Corporation, and the RMR Group. Thank you all again and for your continued support. We especially thank everyone in attendance today for joining our event, and we know you are in store for a wealth of knowledge and great insight. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Greg Gilligan joined the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1987 and has been the business editor for the Richmond Times-Dispatch for the past 10 years this month. Happy anniversary, Greg.
Thank you.
Been on the business desk at the newspaper since 1993, mostly covering the retail industry. He has been our moderator for this event since its inception, and we welcome him back this year to lead our discussion again. Greg, I will turn it over to you, and thank you all and good luck.
Thank you, Brandon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2020 panel discussing the state of the economy. Before we begin our discussion, let me first introduce one of our panelists, Barry Blanton. Barry is the Secretary Treasurer of the Institute for the Institute of Real Estate Management, to talk briefly about the organization. Barry, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Greg, and good morning, everyone. IREM, the Institute of Real Estate Management, was founded in Chicago in 1933 by a small group of property managers who wanted to create and adhere to a standard of ethics in the real estate management industry. Now, think back and remember what was going on in 1933 in Chicago. Al Capone had just gone to prison in 1932. And for those of us that think about next gens a lot, and I do, next gens aren't a new concept. Al was a next gen. He was only 33 years old when he went to prison. But I digress. This was also during the Great Depression, and property still needed to be managed. And back then, good management mattered. Today, IREM is 20,000 plus members strong. We have 80 chapters domestically and 17 international chapters located in 6 countries around the world. For context, IREM certified property managers in the United States manage an estimated $2.1 trillion in assets, 11,600,000 multifamily residential units, and 12 billion square feet of commercial space. While ethics is still a cornerstone of everything IREM members stand for, the Institute provides so much more. Educational offerings for real estate management professionals at every stage of their career. IREM supports a growing number of bachelor degree programs at colleges and universities around the country. And Virginia Tech is one of the best, just saying. IREM offers multiple designations and certifications. We offer the Accredited Residential Manager certification, the ARM, the Accredited Commercial Manager, ACOM, and of course the gold standard, the Certified Property Manager, CPM. Firms managed by CPM members can also apply for the Accredited Management Organization, or AMO designation. There are approximately 600 firms that have earned this designation from IREM. Not that many, but it's a pretty high bar to clear. And IREM is a leader in sustainability, offering the Certified Sustainable Property, CSP, certification for environmentally friendly office, multifamily, and shopping center properties. IREM has always been about research, from our members, for our members, and for their clients. So we're tracking trends in technology and innovation from IREM's in-house research and from MIT's Real Estate Innovation Lab, where IREM supports a lead researcher, James Sky. IREM is all about networking at the local, regional, national, and international levels, and of course, advocacy at the local, state, and federal levels. So what's IREM focusing on today and in the future? IREM has pivoted to support our members through the pandemic and the challenges we're facing today. IREM published the Pandemic Guide for Real Estate Managers and the Real Estate Managers Pandemic Guide for Reopening Your Properties, both of which are free and can be found at www.irem.org. They're fantastic resources. We have NextGen and student outreach. We're focused highly on prop tech, what's new and what's next in new technology for properties. And of course, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives throughout IREM, from the chapter levels through the international. Virtual education and offerings, and providing value and relevance to our members and their clients. So IREM today is about delivering on today's expectations and tomorrow's aspirations, because today, just like we did in 1933, good management matters. At this point, I'll turn things back over to you, Greg, to get this going. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Barry. That was interesting to listen to hear about. So let me just say, wow, what a difference a year can make. At last year's event, the discussion was how the economy was still zooming along with no end in sight. The U.S. back then had just entered the longest economic recovery in history. Stocks were at all-time highs. Inflation was good. The unemployment rate was at historic lows. There was some chatter that the U.S. economy could go into a recession maybe in 2020 or 2021. But then the coronavirus pandemic hit earlier this year, wreaking havoc on our lives and on the economy. Businesses were on lockdown for months. The stock market plunged. The unemployment rate soared to historic high levels. The number of newly laid off workers applying for unemployment aid rose to 1.1 million just last week, after falling below 1 million mark the week before, which was the first time it had reached below the 1 million mark since the pandemic struck 5 months ago. Congress approved an unprecedented amount of aid for the economy. Some portions of that aid have already been expired. Another economic relief package is tied up in the partisan rancor of Congress right now. The U.S. and global economies have shown some improvement since the spring, but are nowhere near to closely fully being healed at this point. The number of virus cases continue to rise across much of the United States, and many industries, such as the airlines, hotels, dining, and retail, it could take years for those industries to recover from this economic damage. Just in the past week in the Richmond region alone, Saks & Shoes, a retailer that has been in business for 67 years, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, blaming the pandemic for its woes. Its sales fell more than 50% in the first 6 months of this year compared with last year, while its expenses continued to mount. And Rolls-Royce announced last week that it's closing its aircraft component factory in Prince George County by the middle of next year and laying off 280 employees. That's on top of the 120 employees that the company laid off in June. So where does the economy stand here in Virginia and across the United States, and where is it heading? That's why we wanted to have this conversation to talk about the economy. And let's turn to the experts. Let me introduce who the panelists are this year. We have Ray Owens. Ray is a senior economist and policy advisor for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He's been there since 1983. We'll have U.S. Senator Mark Warner. He's going to be joining us a little bit later in the program in the next 15 to 20 minutes. Senator Warner is the former Virginia governor who was first elected to the U.S. Senate in 2008, and he serves as vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, among others. We have Brian Ball. Brian is the Virginia Secretary of Commerce and Trade. He was appointed to the job in April of 2018, and before that point, he was a special advisor to Governor Northam for economic development. Before joining the administration, Brian was an attorney with Williams Mullen, where he concentrated on mergers and acquisitions and corporate governance. Lisa Sturtevant is the chief economist of the Virginia Realtors organization, who specializes in economic and housing market analysis. And then finally, we have, as I mentioned, Barry Blanton. Besides his role with IREM, Barry has a day job as the chief, as he calls it, the chief problem solver and founding principal of Blanton Turner, which is a real estate management and consulting firm based in Seattle, Washington. So let's get a brief overview of the economy from Ray Owen. Ray, are you available to talk to us?
I am, Greg. Thank you so much for having me. And I don't have video, so I'll apologize for that up front. Greg, you did a very nice job of covering some of the local developments. And in my remarks, I want to focus more on the U.S. economy overall, as well as a little bit about economic policy, especially monetary policy. As you've mentioned, of course, 2020 will be known as the year of COVID-19. And much of that focus will be, of course, on the public health aspects of it. Certainly with 170,000 dead, approaching 6 million cases soon, we're looking at a public health issue that we certainly haven't seen in over a century. But perhaps close behind that, 2020 will be known for a year of exceptional economic activity. It will be known for basically a year in which we saw the economy dive at an unprecedented rate before recovering. The question remains, where will the US economy be going forward? The first chart, of course, shows the COVID-19 cases. And there are a couple of important points here. One is that as of early March, really, we had no discernible COVID cases, but we certainly had information that it was on the way. And epidemiologists in the US and abroad were warning that this could be quite a serious issue. Indeed, they were right. We see beginning in March a very steep run up in cases. It appeared then to peak sometime in April before then moderating through June. And many thought that perhaps the back of it was broken in June, but as this chart clearly shows, we had a resurgence starting late June, early July, reaching much higher peaks before eventually tapering off somewhat more recently. Now, this is important not only from the public health perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because there's been both dramatic fiscal policy and monetary policy directly related to these cases. Moving on to the next slide, we can see the impact of on the economy. Basically, this shows economic growth in the US stretching back over a decade. Now, on the left, there's a shaded area with some negative bars, and that's the Great Recession. It was a dramatic episode, the worst period for the US economy since the Great Depression of the 1930s. That was followed by 10 years of pretty steady economic growth. Now those bars look very small here, and that's because the right-hand side of the chart. All of that economic growth that we accumulated during that period put us in a very strong position. Equity markets were setting records. As we'll see in a moment, unemployment was at 50-year lows. We created tons of jobs, tons of economic activity, but a lot of that was unwound in simply April of 2020. And that's the massive negative bar on the right-hand side. This has now been rescaled to accommodate this unprecedented episode, this unprecedented meltdown in economic growth. Now I'll say two quick things before moving on. First, those bars for 2021, 2022, and 2023 represent the projections by the Federal Reserve of where they think economic growth will be headed in the next few years. And note that they still look for negative growth in 2021, but a return to positive growth in 2022, 2023. Moving on to the next slide, we can see the accompanying damage in labor markets. This shows non-farm payroll employment. During the Great Recession, you'll see on the left-hand side, you'll see that decline. We lost 8 million jobs, fairly unprecedented. But then job growth took hold in 2010, starting in January of that year, and we created about 20 million new jobs over the following decade. We lost all of those and more in April 2020. Now we've had a bit of a rebound, but note that that rebound, while sharp by historic standards, in no way is getting us anywhere close to the starting point when we dropped off the cliff. Moving on to the next slide. We'll see the labor market in sort of a flow, how many jobs were created. I don't want to dwell on this too much. Again, on the right side, we can see those, what was considered dramatic job losses around the Great Recession, that long period of job growth, about 200,000 net new jobs per month for over a decade, unprecedented job growth. But then, of course, we see the unprecedented declines in jobs earlier this year. Moving on, we would expect to see these kinds of job losses to be associated with a meltdown in consumer income and consumer spending. The next chart then shows us that that indeed was not the case. This shows the growth rate of consumer spending and income, and note that both were on a fairly steady track for years. But if we look at real disposable personal income, the red dotted line, we see during the recent episode, it actually soared, which seems quite strange given the dramatic over 20 million jobs that we lost very quickly. And that's because of our US fiscal policy. The federal government transferred over $3 trillion in transfer payments of various sorts over this period to support people's incomes in the short run for those dramatic job losses. The hope was that the coronavirus would be a V-shaped phenomena and lead to a V-shape, a decline in economic activity. We saw on the prior slide the dramatic downturn, but a fairly quick rebound, upturn. And those payments were thought then to smooth over any short-term disruptions and help the economy move on a good, solid footing. But we know that from the first slide, the coronavirus cases have picked up. It now looks like rather than a V, we're looking at more of a U, or perhaps recently termed a Nike swoosh. In that case, government policy is less effective because this massive payments are stretched out over a longer period of time. And if they don't continue, we're likely to look at some disruptions in the economy that will slow economic recovery going forward into the next several years, consistent perhaps with those Federal Reserve projections that we saw. Moving on to the next slide. We see that prior slide, we had a lot of income, but we noted there perhaps that there was a sharp drop off in spending. Now, people could substitute through the internet some purchases of services, so the disruption wasn't that great on the services side, on the goods side, but it was on the services side. The internet cannot provide as many services, so there was the drop off. What did people do with a lot of that 3 trillion income, that big spike in income? If they weren't spending it, they were saving it. This shows the dramatic increase in the savings rate. And while it's moderated a great deal over the last month or two, we still note that its savings rate is up around 20%. Some of this will be spent in the last few months of this year as presumably businesses open to a greater degree, but we can't dismiss that this also demonstrates still a great deal of caution on the part of households. And if they slow their spending going forward a bit, there's 70% of all the spending in our economy, then a slow recovery perhaps is in our future. Moving on to the next slide, we see that it's not the case that all parts of the economy are falling off of a cliff. Real estate, residential real estate has been doing very well. With the dramatic decrease in economic activity has come fairly dramatic lowering of interest rates. That's translated into low mortgage rates, nearly historically low mortgage rates, and that's supporting the housing market. So that's helping offset some of this weakness to a bit. Moving on now to investment by businesses. In the next slide, we see that with the shutdowns, with demand weakening for services, for goods in some cases, businesses have been very cautious about investing. This too, we see on the far right-hand side of the slide, and this too might slow the pace of recovery because we have an uneven amount of investment, and some firms will take a while to ramp up on this side if the economy, if demand returns and the economy starts to strengthen. To finish up, I have the final slide that summarizes monetary policy, and this is the appropriately perhaps, but rather cutely named dot plot. Each dot represents a member of the FOMC, the committee in the Federal Reserve that conducts monetary policy, and they're answering the question, where will short-term interest rates be at the end of the year shown on the horizontal, the x-axis, if monetary policy is appropriate? You'll note that for 2020, it's pretty universal that rates, which were cut dramatically, now down around zero, they think rates will remain at zero through the end of the year. The same is true for 2021. There are a couple of renegades, perhaps. There are a couple of people who think that we'll begin to see some modest increase in rates in 22, but only a couple out of the total group of 18 or 19. So what we see is a scenario where we've had a dramatic shock to the economy. We've had response on both the fiscal and monetary sides that also can be described as dramatic. And we see expectations, at least out of the Federal Reserve, that the recovery will be a fairly slow one, and that will leave in place fairly aggressive monetary policy for the next year or two, holding down interest rates across most categories. With that, it's a quick cook's view of what's going on out there, and let me thank you again for having me.
Ray, thank you. That was a great overview. I really do appreciate it. Now let's get the other panelists involved a little bit. And Ray, before you're there and stuff, but let me ask you, Ray, and then this is the question for the entire panel. Where do you think the economy was 2 or 3 months ago? And are things getting better or worse? Or maybe putting it in a different way, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best economy ever, 1 being the worst ever, where do you see the economy 2 or 3 months ago? Where do you see it now? Where do you see it going? So basically, so where did you see the economy 2 or 3 months ago, and are things getting better or worse? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you see the economy now? Where did you see it 2 or 3 months ago? Ray, do you want to start off, and then I'm going to go to the other.
Sure, I'll say a couple of brief things. I think it was Dickens who, in one of his novels, says it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Translating that to the current situation, it was the best of economies, it's now the worst of economies in many ways. Outside of the Great Depression of the 1930s, when unemployment hit 25% nationwide, we've not seen an episode like this. I think certainly since we've been keeping records on GDP stretching back to the mid-1800s or so. Or at least we have estimates going back that far. And so in many ways, this is about as bad of an economy as we've seen. That said, there's some quite optimistic signs as we dig our way out of this episode. And we have to remember, COVID was like an asteroid hitting the Earth. If we were to ask the dinosaurs, so how did that work out for you? They would say not well. And in a sense, we're lucky because the strong economy, is the strongest economy in many decades, when this asteroid, COVID asteroid hit, helped save us from perhaps a much more catastrophic outcome. Had we had this happen, because it was a random event, had we had this happen during the Great Recession of a bit over a decade ago, the damage to the economy might well have taken years and even perhaps decades to dig out of. This time, it'll be a slow dig out, as I've mentioned in the comments, but we were quite lucky that it happened. It was dramatic, but that it happened in the economic environment in which it did.
Good. Lisa, why don't you take that? Again, where do you think the economy was 2 or 3 months ago, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10? And are things getting better or worse?
Thanks, Greg. And Ray, thanks for the overview. And so sort of from my perspective, and I'm looking forward to hearing, from Brian and from Senator Warner too, here in Virginia, and as we saw across the nation a couple of months ago, things looked pretty dire when you looked at the economic data, when you looked at the employment numbers, when you looked at the number of new claims for unemployment benefits, when you looked at the escalating number of continued claims for unemployment and the number of businesses that were shuttering. We've had 2 really good months of job growth, both 3 months nationally, 2 months here. New numbers will come out for Virginia tomorrow. And so I think that now we look a little bit better than we did for sure 2 months ago. It's hard to put a number on it. I'll echo what Ray said. This is sort of unprecedented time. So it's almost challenging to try and scale this like you might scale a typical economic event. Looking ahead, I think while we are certainly on the trajectory in the right direction, I think there is uncertainty out there. And so while things are on the way to improving, I think we're going to see sort of stepping forward, stepping back over the next couple of months as we encounter potential new surges in coronavirus cases, some repercussions from reopening perhaps too early in some parts of the country. And so while we are sort of maybe higher up the scale now than we were 2 months ago, and we are certainly headed up the scale, I think we're going to be doing a 1 step back, 1 step forward here for the next couple of months.
Good. Okay. Brian, you want to answer that now?
Sure, I'll take a swing at it. Ray used the term asteroid. We got hit by an asteroid. So if you go back 2 or 3 months, we just gotten hit by the asteroid. And remember, our first case in Virginia of COVID-19, the governor's fond of reminding us this was I think March 7th maybe, but early March. I think as a nation and in the state, we were still trying to figure out at that time what this was going to mean for us. And things went downhill very quickly. So if you go back 2 or 3 months, we were in a pretty deep hole. I don't know what kind of number you want to put on it, but it wasn't anywhere close to 10, and it was getting a lot closer to 1. But since that time, it's been a pretty steady, uneven, I guess is fair, as Lisa said, but we've been digging our way out of this. And the resilience of the American free enterprise system is I get to work on business development and prospecting to bring businesses into Virginia or have businesses that are here expand. And while certain sectors of the economy have been decimated, it's just remarkable to me, the ingenuity and the adaptability of our businesses. And so we continue to actively work on projects. We're bringing in employers. As we have some employers shutting down, we're bringing in new ones. And so you mentioned some of the earlier you mentioned, Greg, some of the closures, and at the appropriate time, I'll mention some of the new employers that we've got in here that are already hiring and expanding. So there's reason for optimism. So I'm sort of heading back above 5 and closer to, we're not at 10 and won't be anytime soon, but we're going in the right direction.
Okay, good, Brian. Appreciate that. Barry, you want to give us your thoughts?
Excuse me. Sure. 2.5, 3 months ago, as everybody's just said, we didn't know where we were. We'd been hit by something, and we were trying to figure out where the ground was to put our feet down. And to that end, I think everybody certainly did their best to pivot. You know, they were figuring out how to work remotely. They were figuring out a lot of things, but they didn't know how long this was going to be. And so they just had to find firm footing or try. Today, I would still say that it's kind of it's a mixed bag. From a small business perspective, it's still a very, very difficult time, and it's uncertain. We don't know when small businesses, restaurants, retail in our communities can open. And flat out, in my opinion, that's the heart and the soul, the culture of most cities, towns, and where people live. I think it's also, it's pretty racking for parents and for people that have kids in school. There are a lot of changes, and one of the big ones, I think, is what happens as kids return to school or they don't, you know, and across the country you have differing stages of that. Up in the Pacific Northwest, pretty much everything's going to be closed in the fall. Universities are also going to be closed and doing remote learning in the fall, and that's a huge adjustment for people. So to that end, when I say that and I'm an optimist, I'm really not a pessimist, but I still think it's pretty uncertain, and I think, as Lisa said, it's a step forward, it's a step back, and I think resiliency and agility and empathy and compassion and maybe a little bit of a sense of humor is going to help us get through this. But I'm not sure that we quite know how long this is. Whether it's pretty tough when you're running a marathon and you look in the rearview mirror and mile 26 was a couple miles ago and you still can't see the finish line, don't know how long this race is, but you got to keep running because there's not a choice. It's pretty tough for folks, and I see that all over. So are we better than we were a couple months ago? I think so. Is it firm footing yet? I don't know that we're quite there yet, but we're working at it.
Good. Well, thank you. Senator Warner, I'm glad you were able to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Craig.
So Senator, I'm not sure if you heard the question, but we're talking about where you think the economy was 2 or 3 months ago, and are things better or worse now than they were then? Or on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 being the best economy ever and 1 being the worst, where's the economy now, and where is it, if you want to put it on a numerical scale?
Well, I heard the end of Barry's comments, and I want to try to build upon them. It's great to see Lisa and Brian on the call as well. I would be very similar to Barry's. I mean, I think, you know, when my office went into initial shutdown on March 11th or 12th, I had no notion that August 20th we'd still be in this kind of shape. And I think, you know, the first 2 or 3 months, we did all right. I think the CARES package historically, you know, Congress putting out $2.7 trillion of direct federal aid, combined with the Federal Reserve, about another 3 to 4 trillion. I think while there were things in it that we got wrong, the fact that it passed unanimously, the fact that Congress acted so quickly, I really think history will say was extraordinarily you know, good policy making. And everybody, Democrats, Republicans, I'll even give President Trump credit for part of that and getting it done. I think we then flooded the market. We kept a lot of people out of poverty. I think late May, early June, we kind of took our eye off the ball. And I think we started to pay the penalty of not having a national strategy on PPE, on testing. I think it's an embarrassment. I saw a poll yesterday that said 70% of Americans are embarrassed by our country's response. And I think a lot of that I will put on the shoulders of the White House. I was on a call last week with nursing homes around Virginia. They're still buying gloves and masks on the black market in China. 6 months in, that is insanity on steroids, that we've not harnessed either through the Defense Production Act, the capability to create a domestic capability, or if we're going to buy from abroad, use the purchasing power of the federal government. And I think we also, even in states like Virginia, I think we kind of presume that we were past this peak, and we didn't keep ramping up even some of our local testing capability. And as the virus came roaring back in the South, I think it caught, again, everyone a bit off guard. One of the things I've been really having a disconnect with is the stock market at record highs in the economy. I got one insight into this that may explain part of it, is that, or a couple reasons that may explain part of it. One, there was a story out yesterday that said if you simply look at Apple, now $2 trillion in value, Facebook, Alphabet, which is Google, Microsoft, and I think I'm forgetting one out of the other, Amazon, you're looking at 20% of the market. And those guys are all doing well. The big box retailers are doing well, but as Barry pointed out, the independent restaurant, the small shop, small businesses are getting creamed. And I actually think we are much closer to, if one is the low, I'd say, stock market's got us at 7. I think the reality is closer to 3 or 4 at this point. And, we've had the unemployment bump up in with a cliff rather than a phase down. PPP money has run out. Schools are kind of in this, oh my gosh, we're going to reopen and then maybe not. You see the UNC circumstance. And I think Congress is being irresponsible. We should get our butts back in town and pass another package. And this is the time where, similar to what Jay Powell has said at the Fed, we ought to over-err on the side of spending too much rather than too little. I was disappointed, actually, that I think we were closer 2 weeks ago than the press portrayed. And I do think the White House actually wants something done. I know, President Trump, who's not exactly a fiscal disciplinarian, it's in his own self-interest for us to get the economy back going. I think the Democrats, were frankly, the numbers were closer than people appeared because there's ways we could have taken unallocated resources from the first package, and we could have, if there was a dire desire to get a deal, we could get that deal. So I think 10 days from now, I fear if we don't do anything, this economy is going to look a lot worse, because I think a lot of folks who are unemployed had enough to get them through a couple weeks. I think businesses, presuming there were going to be another round of PPP, I got enough to get them through a little bit more time. I think you're going to see the start and stop, particularly if colleges start going back to virtual, where you'll see communities that rely upon that college revenue come to a halt. So I'm also generally a pretty optimistic person, but on the short-term perspective, I'm a bit pessimistic. And I know we'll get later into the conversation how this is economically and health-wise disproportionately hurt some of our minority communities. And I'll have some more comments then.
That's great. And actually, Senator, you kind of lead into my next kind of questions for the panel is we've looked back, since the beginning of the year to now, but where do we see the economy going in the next 6 months? I mean, Senator, you talked a little bit about it, but what are some of the clouds that exist on the horizon that could create problems for the economy? What are some of the biggest challenges? Who wants to start off that discussion? Lisa, Brian?
Yeah, sure. I'll hop in. I think there are some risks as we look ahead, and I think some of them have been mentioned. One thing Greg, you mentioned sort of looking 6 months out, and I do think we are in the period where we're almost thinking of a kind of pre-vaccine, post-vaccine stage of this recovery. And so that 6 month really puts us very squarely in still this pre-vaccine world where we're doing things really differently. And I think there's a couple of risks. I think Senator Warner alluded to one. I think the consumer spending, which really is 70% of the economy, as we know, was really supported by the stimulus payments and the expanded unemployment benefits. And as those go away, that savings rate that Ray reported on will get drawn down, and spending in the economy will slow. And that is a risk if there isn't additional assistance made available. I think as we look ahead, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about this disproportionate impact that Senator Warner mentioned, I think there's going to be increasing challenges for renters, particularly going forward, who have been hardest hit by employment and income loss. And there's a lot of talk about evictions. I'll be honest with you, the data on rent payments are pretty strong at this point, and property managers and landlords across Virginia are working with tenants to work out payment plans, but there's only so long that can be sustained. And so I think those two things are the sort of what I'll mention is just this idea of a drawdown in consumer spending without additional assistance to those hardest hits, and then kind of what happens to renters and landlords and property managers as it gets more and more challenging for renters to make their rent payments in the months to come.
I'll take a swing at this, and I'm not going to rehash what either Senator Warner or Lisa said. Obviously, I think we all understand that we need another stimulus package sooner rather than later to avoid some of the things that we're all worried about as far as people being able to pay rent and take care of their families. As far as we're still in a pre-vaccination mode, and we're going to be there for a while. We, optimistically, maybe at the end of the year, but it's probably going to be sometime in 2021. I think the key to keep this economy moving, even though it may be, let's say, it's hobbled to some degree, is frankly how people behave. And the senator pointed out some of the spikes we're seeing in other parts of the country. So far, so good here. We had to pull back in Hampton Roads, and this governor, fortunately, is a physician and watches this data very carefully. But I think the key to sort of to moving forward in a positive way, albeit a limited way, is how we behave. UNC came up as an example. I don't think universities are unsafe places. I think they've got great plans for reopening, but I think students have a different ideas about how they're going to live and behave outside of the classroom environment. And so you're getting people congregating, and you're getting a rapid spread. And so it's the same message we've been providing all along. And it should be a national policy, but state by state. And we certainly are subscribed to the, wear your mask, socially distance, and avoid large groups of people. And we're going to be there for the foreseeable future, but you can still function and get a lot of things done, even in that constrained environment.
Mm-hmm.
Just to weigh in on challenges over the next 6 months, I think the 800-pound gorilla in the room is politics, and we have an awful big event coming up here in November. But I'm going to leave the politics to the professional politicians. I think that, but there's going to be a lot of change, one way or the other, going forward. But I tend to focus on challenges having to do with some of our imbalances right now. We have economic polarization. We have some of the gaps are widening. Some people are doing really well economically, while others are hanging on for survival, as we were just talking about some of the small businesses as opposed to some of the big businesses. In Seattle, like most major metropolitan cities around the country, the homelessness problems are getting worse. And in Seattle, it's not lost on me that while that's certainly the case, the owner of Amazon, or the founder of Amazon, is worth personally more than McDonald's Corporation. That's a reality. Those are realities that we look at every day. 50% of the people moving out of our apartments in Seattle are moving home, wherever home is. They're moving back home because they're uncertain about their jobs. They've lost their jobs. They want to be close to their families. They're moving into their parents' basement. And that's not an invitation to my son to move back home into my house. But with that said, the other 50% of the people that are leaving our apartments are buying homes. And the prices in Seattle haven't come down. The interest rates are exceptional. And there are those that can go out and buy homes, and they're going out and they're buying homes. So you have the haves, you have the have-nots, and it isn't lost on me either. The stock market's at an all-time high, and so is the U.S. unemployment rate. So right now, it's just vastly divergent in terms of what the experiences people are having in this country. So one has to beg the question, I guess, how much can the country bend before it breaks? And over the next 6 months, I don't know what that looks like. And me being an optimist, I believe we'll fix it, because once we come together, we can. But we have to come together to fix this,
Right.
and address this. So I would leave it at that.
Let me just build upon
Please. Yes.
all of the panelists' comments. Agree with Brian that to get the economy back, we got to get the virus under control. And the lack of a national plan here, I think is still going to haunt us. It's not impossible. If I think Barry being in Seattle, our neighbors to the north, Canada, they got a similar first world economy. They've done a great job without sacrificing people's individual freedoms and liberties. South Korea has done a great job. Germany's done at least a B+ job. We've done a failing job. And again, this is not a partisan comment. I think it's just a reality that when the kind of president says, whether it's 160 or 170,000 people died, it is what it is. It's not exactly a rallying cry to we can beat this. It's not that kind of call to arms that has been pushed down to the states and the governors to carry out. And it's really hard to carry that out on a state-by-state basis. I'm really concerned, Lisa's comment, that if we have a repeat of the ineptness that we saw on PPE and testing take place on vaccinations, we could have disruption in the streets. If there's a feeling that the first people that are getting vaccinated are the folks with the most money and the folks with the most connected, I don't know how much the other 70 or 80% of Americans will be able to take if they feel they're getting the short end of the stick. And again, it's not even for those of us who've done well, it's not even our own self-interest to go to the front of the line on vaccinations, because the more we can hit the communities that have been disproportionately hit, the sooner we can get the virus under control. And I do think, I heard something last night with a senior member of the administration I was with, that there may be more progress on vaccinations. I don't want to get too optimistic, and I sure as heck don't believe Vladimir Putin's comments last week when Russia said they've got it. But I remain a little bit optimistic there. But gosh, we gotta have a fair and equitable plan of getting the vaccinations out. And I do think I saw data this morning that said that for folks over 60,000 in income in this country, which isn't exactly wealthy at over 60, the unemployment rate is down to like less than 0.5%. And it is the people who are low income who are still getting creamed. It is our Black and brown community still getting creamed. That comment that Bezos is worth more than McDonald's. I was a business guy longer than I've been a politician. I got nothing wrong with people doing well, but boy, oh boy, when the things get this far out of whack, I guess as somebody at least indirectly being referred to as one of the professional politicians on the panel, although I put Brian kind of in a quasi category there. But it's just one of the biggest critiques I would have of the administration, and I just don't think this is going to change, is that there's kind of no rallying cry that we're all in it together. There's no kind of empathy for those who are, so struggling at this point. I mean, I know we use the term stimulus. I actually think it's hardship payments more than anything. And I think there are so many people on the verge. One of the things I do hope, and I think there was this is one of the areas where I think there was actually more agreement than people realized in the next package, that there would have to be meaningful renter assistance, because eviction forbearance is great, but I think all but maybe a few on my side also acknowledge that if you simply don't pay the landlord still has to pay the mortgage, but you're simply pushing the problem further upstream or downstream, depending on where you view it. So some additional help here, particularly in the real estate field, has got to be part of it. I mean, I signed on to a piece of legislation on independent restaurants that put $120 billion. Now, I'm not sure that's going to become law, but I do think as a bit of a foodie, regardless of any of you who saw my gross tuna melt video, as a bit of a foodie, I think independent restaurants play a role in our community beyond just serving food. They're gathering spots. They're part of kind of who we see ourselves as. And I don't want to have coming out of this that our only choices are chain restaurants, even if McDonald's is smaller than Bezos' fortune.
Let's talk let's talk a little bit about what and Senator, this is really kind of more directed to you and then to the others as well. But what do we need to do to help boost the economy? What needs to be done? Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, and we can talk about the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program. We can talk about the jobless benefit programs. But Senator Warren, start us off a little bit if you wouldn't mind. Because you were part of that negotiating process for the CARES Act. Looking back, what do you think were the biggest successes of that CARES Act, and what are the failures from that package?
Well, I think the biggest successes was that we got the money out the door pretty quickly, and it was large amounts. I think PPP net was a success. I think the money to the hospitals was a success. I think we should have done more for state and local government and should not have had a prohibition that they couldn't use those funds for lost revenue, which was just wacky in my mind. We gave small businesses for loss of revenues. We gave the airlines money for loss of revenues, but somehow we're saying the state and local government can't use it for lost revenues. That's wacky. So and the fact that the Congress didn't bicker on it and point fingers, that we actually did it in a bipartisan way, all were success. Now on the failures, let me give you, I got a bunch of them in there, so let me, and I'll try to be brief. I think on the design on PPP, we should have had a requirement to show some level of revenue loss. I think we'll never, I'm not sure we'll ever get full exposure of the number of firms, and I've got friends who own some of these firms that were, money management or other firms that didn't get hit at all, and we're still getting basically free money. I think the distribution, and I don't blame the banks by any means, but I think the distribution model of using the banks really left out Black-owned businesses, Latino businesses, women-owned businesses, who oftentimes did not have established banking relationships. And I hope we'll get to a subsequent question. I've got, I think, a bipartisan idea on how we can fix that. I think on one of the other areas that was a huge failure was the whole Main Street facility. We did pretty well for the large public enterprises with the Fed being able to buy corporate debt. We did pretty well for the small businesses, but those 500 to 5,000 employee firms, the middle market firms, got totally left behind. And we built in something called a Main Street facility that, frankly, the Fed took way too long to set up. The take-up rate has been remarkably low. And I'm still amazed that those middle market firms, oftentimes retail, mid-sized manufacturing, didn't squawk more through this period. And then finally, and I've got a bipartisan plan. Well, there's variations on the plan. If we could have it all over again, rather than doing PPP and Main Street and all these different facilities, I wish we would have set this up in the direct payroll support the way the European countries and others have, where I have a plan called the Paycheck Security Act, where we could use the payroll processors and others and have the federal government simply pay a percentage of people's income. That would have not had people be disconnected from their firms. It would have kept their health care in place. You could have dialed that easily. One thing we did get into the code that I was proud to be the author of was called the Employee Retention Tax Credit. It's relatively modest at this point, but that could have been used as a dial where we could have said, all right, we're going to pay 75, 85, 90% people's salary up to, pick your number, 70,000, 80,000, 90,000. And I think that would have been a better distribution model. But net, I'd still give, I think history will look back at CARES, the CARES 2 packages and say, they really prevented a catastrophe.
All right, so the others, what do you all think, were the good points, the bad points? So the Paycheck Protection Program, the Enhanced Jobless Benefit Program, and the $600, which is now ended. Do we still need that? I mean, we've heard anecdotally where there's some employees who've decided back in June and July when they could have gone back to work that it was better to take the benefit, the enhanced benefits, than they're making more money that way than actually going to work. So the other panelists, well, what do you think about some of these programs? What were some successes? What were some failures?
Go ahead, Go ahead, Brian.
Well, just having had to live with it at the state level, I agree with Senator Warner. The alacrity with which the Congress acted to get the PPP program created and out the door was one of those rare moments where bipartisan support is ubiquitous, and it happened, and it gave a lot of people a lot of hope. And the banks actually, I would say, were effective in deployment, but remember, they were effective in deployment first and foremost to their existing customer bases, and we had to nudge some of the credit unions along in that space too, because the banks that had a lot of SBA, Small Business Administration lending experience, could adapt very quickly to this. Some of the banks that didn't, it took them a little longer. But there were a lot of small businesses left behind, and businesses, women-owned and minority-owned businesses. And we saw that. We have data points to show that, and that's because a lot of these businesses didn't have banking relationships. And so if we're going to do another package, I'd love to see some refinement in that. We've set up a small business with some of our funding under the CARES package. We've set up a small business grant program, and a condition of eligibility is that you have not gotten either PPP money or economic injury disaster loan funding, because we wanted to, and we're trying to target distressed areas of the state, whether they be urban or rural throughout the state. So we're trying to follow behind what the federal government has done and use some of our funding to do that. The other thing we've stood up, and I know most of you all are in the real estate business, is we have an eviction program that we've set up, and we've committed quite a bit of money to that. What we're finding is we had to roll this program out quickly. We don't want evictions. We don't want people on the street in a time of crisis. You can look at that as a humanitarian thing or as self-interest, because sick people roaming around is not a healthy thing. So we're trying to avoid homelessness at all costs. But what we haven't seen is the takedown of the funding we've had right now, and we're trying to work with landlords and tenant representatives to try to get the program deployed, because particularly if we don't get a new package soon, people are not going to have the ability to pay rent.
Barry, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I would say first of all, I applaud the senator and the government for getting the first stimulus package out and getting it out quickly and working together to do that. That's a huge issue, and was well done. I think I'm concerned that we're here in phase 2 now of needing it some more, and now we're kind of starting to see, politics kind of play a role in this, and we're playing politics with people's lives. And I mean, anyone that's on this call, listening to this call, we know people that are affected. And so, at some point, I'm a little disappointed that we're starting to see some of the gamesmanship that we didn't see in the first place, which was so impressive. I think that when it comes to the PPP program, that was huge, and that was so good for so many. I think that yes, there are going to be some people out there that abuse it, but mostly not. Mostly it went to where it was supposed to go, and it's got a residual effect, and that's good. I'm concerned about, I would first, and I would say, I think I'm speaking for everybody I know in this industry. No one wants to see anyone lose their homes, and they don't want to see them lose their businesses. The eviction moratoriums, and up in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically here in Washington and in Seattle, that's been extended to the end of the year. So that it's different in different municipalities, and I get that. What we're going to need to do, though, is understand that at the end of it, now we have a problem again, because we have a lot of people who have made arrangements to pay later, and they're doing that both out of necessity and, in fact, in the spirit of it, they intend to. But these are huge, huge debts that are mounting. They're not going to be able to pay those debts. It's not going to be an easy thing, and so we're going to have to have help for people, right? We're going to have help for people to pay their rent, whether that's at the residential level or the commercial level, and honestly, those people that can pay should pay, and those people that can't pay should be taken care of, because we want them to stay in their homes, stay in their businesses. But we're going to need some help, and we're going to need some support, financial support, and that would be something that I would hope comes through, and it's going to be clear and easy to access, because we, again, are all in this together. And so I'll be quiet. I'm pontificating.
So Lisa, can you and Ray, can you address it from an economic standpoint? You're the economist on the panel. So how did the CARES Act, how did the PPP program, how did, the enhanced benefits, economically, was it good, bad? Talk to us about that.
Well, I'll say a few words first, perhaps. I'm always more than a little bit hesitant to speak to fiscal policy, because I work for a monetary policy shop, and we have no responsibility, obviously, for fiscal policy, and perhaps quite a small amount of knowledge about it. That said, I think it's fair to say that this was an unprecedented disruption to the economy, and the distortions that it could have resulted in terms of the all-important household spending behavior, to business investment, to financial markets across the board, could have been quite a bit larger, perhaps even magnitudes larger than we saw during the Great Recession. So the risks of doing nothing were massive. So we couldn't do nothing, it appeared. I think then basically the transfers that Senator Warner detailed, the aggressive monetary policy that I covered earlier in my brief comments, were absolutely necessary in this setting. The longer this drags on, perhaps the effectiveness in creating a rapid rebound will wane somewhat, and that's I think the biggest single risk facing us going forward. So yeah, I think these things were absolutely necessary in the short term. I think we don't know the path of the virus at this point, and then the necessity, whether it's dire or whether it's marginal, none of us really know. But I think healthy debate and keeping a close eye on it is essential going forward. And the last thing I'll say is, for the most part, most of the governors of the Federal Reserve System, as well as the majority, if not all, I don't monitor that carefully, I'm afraid, have certainly supported both the past transfers, and there's been some support for some ongoing transfers to try to offset this problem, try to avoid some of those deep distortions in the economy going forward.
Greg, I'll just very briefly, because I concur with what has been said, but and to echo what Senator Warner said, I think the CARES Act and the stimulus money that came to the economy, as Ray mentioned, was essential to keeping this sort of unprecedented, devastating shock to our society and to the economy from being even worse. The quickness, the relative quickness, and bipartisan nature through which the money was made available to businesses and individuals was certainly incredibly welcome. The only thing, and the thing I'll add, is I think it also provided a little bit more innovation maybe than we have seen maybe in the past. And I'm thinking in particular about, like, for example, the pandemic unemployment assistance, which made assistance available to folks through the unemployment insurance system who wouldn't normally have qualified. And for the real estate industry in particular, that was a really welcome form of assistance that self-employed folks, independent contractors, gig workers, all had access to assistance that they wouldn't have had access to otherwise. And I think, and Greg, I know we're going to talk about the future, this is where we start thinking about how do we come back. We're not going to come back the same way to the same economy we had before, because now I think those differences and those different accesses, different ability to access economic assistance and opportunities, we want to come back in such a way that folks who, who didn't have as many opportunities before are afforded more in the new economy that we build after coronavirus.
Can I jump in here? Because I think Lisa's last point, I want to make 3 quick points. One, we can argue about the 600, whether it's too much, too little, what the phase out ought to be. But I 100% agree that this expansion of the social safety net to include gig workers, independent contractors, sole proprietors was such a long overdue. Nobody's going to work for the same job for 30 years the way my dad did. People are going to move, and we need to have a benefit system that attaches to individuals and is portable. And this expanded unemployment, you're going to need the payer to pay in, so it's not just federal government sponsored, but we need to continue that, number one. Number two is a little bit of a, homer nod to the industry. One of the other areas we screwed up was not acknowledging that, particularly in real estate development, if you have an asset that you're building, but you don't have revenues from the preceding year, you kind of got the short end of the stick. And the Fed and others said they were going to try to work through that. I don't think we fully have, but I know a lot of real estate development folks who were midstream in a project who were like, holy heck, we can't keep our workers working, but we don't qualify because there is no preceding revenue stream that you can measure against. And I think we need to rectify that. And I do think, echoing again where we head from here, I think this whole pandemic accelerated the move to a digital economy by a decade. And in some areas like telehealth, that was good. And if it's easier to look back and throw stones at what we didn't get right. We should have done a lot more in that first CARES package on broadband funding, and we should have also, my background is Brian and Ray and some of the folks in Virginia, Lisa know, was all in telecom, was in the wireless business, but we should have had emergency regulations that would have allowed temporary towers to be put on schools and elsewhere to provide that emergency internet, wireless internet service. Now, the ISPs would have not liked that, but the fact that we would have, we could have increased coverage 30 or 40% in Virginia with virtually no cost if we would have done that simply from a more aggressive FCC was probably a look back I wish we should have.
So Senator, let me ask you, very briefly, what do you think the top priorities should be in the next stimulus package? And can something really come together in this current political environment that we're in?
Yeah, I actually am optimistic. I think there's pretty wide agreement. You are going to need a phase down on the unemployment rather than the cliff. You are going to need some additional assistance to state and local governments, and whether we call that state and local or whether we call it public education, they're kind of all in the same bucket. We are going to need some additional help for small businesses, particularly those that are, kind of not corporate tied. I hope that we will do something on broadband. You are going to need some additional assistance on testing requirements. And again, I hope we get to the something that I'm working very hard on. I've got a big bipartisan support for something that will structurally change access to capital for Black, brown, women, and small businesses that did not participate in or were not successful in the first round.
Good, thank you. So let's shift briefly let's talk about the real estate area. And there's two areas, one residential and one commercial. So let's start off, Lisa, if you would mind. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the the residential real estate market. I know the Virginia Realtors Group this morning released its July sales report. What's the outlook for the third and the fourth quarter, and what trends are we seeing? I mean, one trend that we're writing about is how there seems to be some thinking of people maybe moving from urban areas to more suburban or rural areas because of COVID. But if they do that, as the senator just talked about, we need broadband out there, and that's where the broadband is not. What about larger homes? Are people buying large homes because they want, they need it for their home offices and stuff? So can you talk a little bit about the residential real estate market?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. We in the residential side of the market and on the for sale side of the market, we saw a slowdown in housing market activity, right? As the pandemic closed businesses and their stay-at-home directives were put into place. But like the economy here in Virginia, the housing market and housing demand in particular was incredibly strong going into the pandemic, primarily because of demographic reasons. We have a big old pile of folks in their early 30s and mid 30s that are reaching that prime home buying age. And those underlying demographic trends that are driving demand for housing, those aren't going away. But what they did do is they got pushed a little bit further into the year. So while we had a sort of a slower market in April and May, the housing market in Virginia really bounced back with quite a bit of force in July, and really just sort of a shifting of that market activity from the spring. And one reason why we saw a fairly resilient housing market and really a V-shaped recovery to the housing market when we're sort of in that U or swoosh shape for the economy, is something I think we've all kind of alluded to a little bit, but I just want to make a little bit more explicit, is the folks who are disproportionately impacted by job and income loss were really highly focused in that leisure and hospitality sector, restaurants, bars, hotels, some administrative support occupations as well. Folks in those occupations tend to be younger, they tend to have lower wages, they tend to be renters. And so when you think about that savings rate, you have a whole pool of potential home buyers who are sitting at home with their relatively insulated job, not spending any money, looking at their four walls. And when that ability to go out and purchase a home was made available to them, there was all of this pent up demand. And so, as we kind of look and see what happened, the housing market really recovered pretty strongly. I think going forward, Greg, to your question about will preferences change, will locations of where people are looking to buy a home will change, I think that we are certainly seeing, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about this when it comes to office space, a lot of it will depend on whether this work from home environment that many professional and technical services workers are in right now, whether that work from home environment will be a permanent situation or whether it will be temporary. There's really interesting survey research out there that suggests there's a big cohort of folks who want to go back to the office, right? And interestingly, it's younger workers who want to go back in the office. They don't want to work in their apartment with their roommates in the next room, and they miss out on opportunities to engage with older colleagues and to have those professional development opportunities. And so I think the jury, aside from the Facebooks and the Twitters and of the world, I think the jury is a little bit still out on whether this work from home is a permanent feature of our economy. But it is without a doubt on the margins. There will be some folks, and I'm thinking of folks maybe who live in the higher cost parts of Virginia. I live here in Fairfax County, so Northern Virginia, where home prices are quite high. If they are able to work from home, then it might make places down in the Blue Ridge area, down in Roanoke, down the Eastern Shore, more attractive. And we're starting to see a little bit of that around the edges. Just to conclude that, this issue of reliable access to internet, I'm afraid, and this is a theme we keep coming back to, it's really been fascinating, this access to reliable internet is really going to sort of separate the haves from the have-nots in terms of communities across Virginia. So if you have places where that is not a possibility, they're going to miss out on sort of new residents and sort of people looking to those kinds of places. So we look for, like I said, there was a really fast recovery in the market. Q3 looks pretty good. We didn't I didn't mention mortgage rates. That's, they're going to be low according to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and what Ray said throughout 2021. So that's sort of it's really interesting to talk about, but we don't anticipate a lot of changes. And really in our market, the constraint continues to be that there just aren't enough homes for people to buy. And with the new construction numbers up this week showing a ramp up in single family building, that'll help for sure. But Q3 looks pretty good, and all the risks we talked about earlier are still at play in terms of the housing market. But the market here in Virginia has been relatively resilient.
Lisa, you touched on, I'm thankful that you did, and maybe Barry or Brian can touch on this next topic about the commercial side of the business. So, do we need all this office space? And there are some companies like Nationwide Insurance, for instance, they announced back in late April, early May, that they were closing all their regional offices across the country, like the one they have here in Chesterfield County, and have those employees permanently work from home. Google's parent company announced last month, I believe, that their workers won't return to the office until mid next year, and Twitter's CEO said this spring that Twitter workers could continue working from home forever, even after the pandemic. So, how is the economy, the pandemic, everything impacting the demand for commercial space? What's the outlook there? Barry, Brian, do I want to take that?
I'll take a swing at it in Virginia. Barry has a worldview, but and I'm not going to limit my comments just to commercial real estate. But what's happening with this pandemic and whether it's going to affect office space and how many people are willing to get on an elevator, that's all going to take some time to play out, and we won't know until we're past this whether it's how permanent the impacts are. But the thing that I want to stress, I do want to mention that broadband is a huge priority of this administration's, and it's not just for it's not just for teleworking, but it's also for schools. And as you're seeing schools not opening, we've got to get broadband much quicker down the road than it currently is, and we're putting up our own money to do that. Senator Warner would love to have the federal government be an active part of that too. I'll pass that on. But the thing that I want to mention on the commercial side, people. I think one of the questions we talked about earlier when we were preparing for this is what impacts has COVID had on traditional economic development activities, which is my area of responsibility. And the answer is huge impacts, but has it stopped it? Have we all gone home and are waiting until the clouds clear? The answer is no. We're working our butts off to keep bringing projects into Virginia. And I've just was talking with Turner Widgeon, one of my colleagues this morning. I keep a sharp eye on this. Senator Warner knows I watch the job creation and the CapEx on a cumulative basis, and I net out any bad projects that don't matriculate. But we're jealous about that, and we do it. But since we've been in this pandemic, we've been able to do a 1,500 person software development site with Microsoft in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax County. In fact, right outside of Reston. That's an example. Hershey in the Valley, Augusta County, has done a $100 million expansion there with well over 100 new employees. Hershey's business has been one of those. People like to eat Reese's Cups during recessions and pandemics, so that's going well. East Coast Repair is doing it's a minority-owned business in Newport News, is doing a repair shop for Navy ships down there, 330 employees. I'm not going to give you every one of them. T-Mobile in the Richmond area, 500 expansion. So I mean, I'm viscerally sick every time I get a Warnock notice, but at the end of the day, I have to go back into the office and keep working these projects. And one that I am extremely proud of for this administration, we had the IKEA plant in Danville, Pennsylvania area, notice that they were closing in the fall, right as we headed into the holiday season. We were able to turn an awful situation, 300 jobs gone. We now have a manufacturer in that same space, Morgan Olson. They make step vans for home delivery. They can't make step vans fast enough. So in a period of the fall to now, we were just down there. They're making step vans, and they've got over 300. They've more than replaced the jobs that were lost, and they're headed to a 700. And they're making vans for the Amazons of the world, the UPSs, the Federal Expresses, and whatever happens with all this, I think people, one of the habits going into retail stores people are very used to ordering online now and getting product delivered to their homes. And I think that's going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Terry?
First, it's just great listening to the different folks in their inputs. I thank you. I'm learning. I would say from an office perspective, I've talked to people all over the country and just kind of getting a thumb on the pulse, taking the temperature of what they're feeling. There is a general feeling that office demand is going to shrink up a little bit. We have in fact determined out of necessity that working from home and working virtually and remotely not only is possible, people didn't really trust it before they had to, and now we've had to. And so I think a few things. The first is where there was a distrust of working remotely and working from home before the pandemic, people do understand that you can produce the work in many cases remotely and from home. I think there's a newfound appreciation for going to work and the camaraderie that happens in the office environment and the work environment. And so I think that the future is going to hold that there will be a bit of a hybrid. I think that it is possible to work from home. I think that depending on where you are in the country, if schools aren't open, you're going to have some people work from home because they're going to have to do some educating from home to their kids too. And we're going to have to learn about flexibility. Part of the flexibility that we need to understand is it's not just about what we can produce, but it's our happiness factor. It's our satisfaction factor with our employment and our jobs, and people need socialization too. And then that blends into the whole retail thing and all of the downtown cores. Today it's pretty devastated. What happens tomorrow depends on how many people can actually and will actually come back to work. The work environment, the office environment, interior office environment will pretty much have to change as well. It had gotten pretty efficient. There were quite a few people per square foot in office configurations, a lot more open office configurations. And until we're clear of this pandemic, we need to practice social distancing. Actually, I'm going with physical distancing because people really don't want to socially distance, but they do need to physically distance. And so then the question becomes, okay, so are people going to be contracting and using less space, or are they just going to use the same space and have fewer people come in at a time and chunk it out a little bit differently? So we'll see about that. But I think the jury is still out. I do believe that there is, and now I'm talking actually more locally to the Seattle area, but there's certainly a demand for people to come back to work. I think Lisa mentioned that earlier, where people really would like to come back to work, see each other, and work together again. We can't do that yet, and we shouldn't do that until it's safe to do that. When it comes to the big corporations, we have that here too. Clearly, we have Amazon, we have Microsoft, we have big corporations here, and their practices, they're out trying to find more office space now. They have been all along. We have 50,000 people in Seattle metropolitan area that work for Amazon alone. And they just took down another 1 million feet in Bellevue. And now they're looking at what they're calling micropods, where they're doing smaller business units in some of the outlying areas. That's a trend, that's a change. And so, how are people living? I think they're gonna live a little differently. The units were getting smaller in the urban cores. They were very expensive, but then you got the amenities package was the urban core. It was all 42 restaurants within walking distance. It was the nightlife, and it was all that stuff. Well, that's all closed. And so right now it's all closed. So what happens? If people have to work in a very, very small apartment remotely, it's kind of a caged feel. They're getting tired of it, right? So what are they going to be looking for? They're going to be looking for something else, whatever that might be to them. So I think it's a little early to know exactly how it's going to shake out, but it's going to be a little different. And I think the silver lining is we have learned that we can work remotely, and the world didn't come to an end when we did. In fact, work got done. And my biggest problem is that people burn out when they're working remotely and at home all the time, because you don't know when you've stopped working and when you've started living, and your week becomes weekends, and your weekends become months, and all of a sudden you haven't left home in months.
Right.
That's not healthy.
Yeah, that's true. Barry, thank you. So, IREM is going to slap my wrist because we were supposed to open this up for discussion to the audience and stuff for questions. We just really don't have the time. So in the last 5 minutes, again, very briefly to each of the panelists, tell me, what are your last thoughts on the economy? What are your expectations? What is your hope for the future, for recovery? What are your expectations for employers, employees, for the small business owner, for the real estate agent? What? And I guess in 60 seconds, each of you tell me what's the outlook.
Well, let me start because I want to put a plug in on something I've been working on that I think will have both short-term and long-term structural effect. We know the COVID has hit Black and brown communities harder. It's also hit them economically harder. 2.7 million Black-owned businesses in America, 440,000 have already shut their doors. Traditional lenders have not been the answer. I have an $18 billion initiative that has 7 Republican co-sponsors, 7 Democrats. I've been working closely with Secretary Mnuchin. That would take that $18 billion, wouldn't take new money, would take it out of the Main Street facility, put about $3 billion into direct support for Black-owned banks and community development financial institutions, CDFIs, of which there are 1,100 around the country. We've got 16 in Virginia. We could use a few more that have a history of lending into low-income communities. $3 billion would go into a direct grant program. About $10 billion would go into an investment of long-term tier 1 capital that could be leveraged further at a 10-to-1 ratio, another $100 billion of lending capacity. And then I've got the support of certain members of the Fed board and Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen. I still think there ought to be a 13-3 facility, a Fed facility here that would buy up some of the newer loans, similar to what already exists for the some of the larger institutions. So a short-term but also long-term structural building capacity of lending into these communities that really are going to need some longer-term quality of access to capital is something I'm very big on. And I'll just add at the last 2 seconds, every one of these are programs that already existed for certain parts of the financial industry after the 2008-2010 crisis. So this is simply extending it to the literally third of America that has been disproportionately hurt economically, and I think could be one of those bipartisan wins, short-term and long-term.
Okay,
that was
Brian.
not bad. That was not bad for a senator. That was almost a minute.
That was 3 minutes long, but okay.
Well, but in Senate speak, that's a minute.
Brian, you want to?
Yeah, Lisa mentioned that a lot of younger people want to get back into the office. I'm an older person, maybe the oldest on the phone, and I'm in the office, and I like being in the office, but we're all trying to be smart. But I'm not known for optimism, but I have to say I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because I get to work on projects every day to get business in here. I know we have some short-term challenges, but as I said at the beginning, thank God for the American free enterprise system, because a lot of businesses, large and small, all over the state of Virginia, and I'm sure all over the country, but I see it here, are looking past this pandemic, and they're making decisions about how to invest capital and how to employ people. And that's what makes us great as a people and as a nation. And so I'm confident we're going to get through this. I don't know when the vaccination is going to show up, but if we act and behave in a smart way until then, we'll be okay. We'll get through this, and that's just the way I feel based on what I see and what I'm doing on a daily basis. You all have been talking in macro terms. I live in a very micro world here in what I do. So thank you very much for letting us be part of this.
Barry, what about you?
I think very quickly, I think that we should take advantage of the silver linings that have come from this. Here we are on a Zoom meeting. We're talking to everybody on this Zoom meeting. We need to connect the dots. We need to make the world smaller. We need to work together to come through this. We have a common adversary here. It's called a pandemic. Let's get through it, and let's work together to do that. If we can do that, we can be better at the end. It'll be different. We're not going back, we're going forward. So I would leave it with that.
And Lisa and then Ray, you guys get to finish up the Economist on the panel. Help us out.
Yeah, and I am, to echo Brian, I'm optimistic. Let's say I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm an economist, so I'm cautious by nature. But I think that we have a lot of room to be optimistic about the long-term outcome for the economy and for individuals and families across Virginia and across the country. In the shorter term, though, to put a few concrete kind of thoughts around what we might expect in the next year. The residential side of the market, I feel like, is really, there's a lot of fundamentals to buoy that market. I think in the short term, we're going to see some, increases in rental vacancy rates, some declines in retail rents. We're going to see sort of a rethinking of office space, but I think Barry's right. We're going to maybe see a repositioning of office space, maybe not a huge contraction of office space. And I think we're going to use this next year to really think about how to be innovative, both in use of technology and use of space, so that when we come out on the other side, we might be doing business a little bit different, but we might be doing it stronger.
And Ray?
Well, I think there are a lot of outcomes in our future, a range that's vast. Our best guess, our best forecast perhaps, is that we'll see modest recovery ongoing. It could be better than that. There could be pleasant surprises on vaccines and other very important issues. But as we've learned in the past few months, there could also be disappointing events that would happen. Epidemiologists, for example, warn that with the regular flu season coming on, that there could be complications that we don't fully anticipate. And that could send us back to square one, perhaps. But our best forecast right now is modest recovery, but in an environment of extreme uncertainty. Uncertainty even beyond that we saw during the Great Recession. So with that, we'll hopefully find our way through. I think this will cause changes. I think it'll cause changes in the way we think about constructing new office buildings, the physical configuration. I think it'll cause big changes in education. Professors have been very reluctant to consider online, but they've been forced into it now. And once the technology is there, they know about it, they'll see windows where it actually provides value. Not fully perhaps, but windows. And so I think there'll be some silver linings out of this in the long term, and that'll perhaps firm the foundations a little bit for economic growth. But whether that's months, years in our future, with so much uncertainty, none of us know at this point.
Good, thank you, Ray. Yeah, I had pages of questions to ask for this panel, and unfortunately time didn't permit. But I think it was a great discussion of where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. I just hope next year, if they have IREM has a similar panel next year, that we can all discuss what a difference a year makes a year from now, and that the economy is back on the road to recovery at that point, and this will just be a blip on the screen. But let me thank again, before I have Brandon come online, again to Senator Warner. It was good to see you again, even though we're virtual. It's been a while. It's good to see you and stuff. Brian, thank you very much for participating. Barry, I had to get very early out on the West Coast and stuff. Thank you very much for doing so. Ray Owens, thank you always as very much for your insight into the economy, and again, Lisa, yours as well. It's good to work with you again. Thank you for participating as well. So let me turn it over to Brandon for closing remarks.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you again to all the panelists. I think everybody can agree that this was incredibly insightful, a lot of great information, and we certainly appreciate on behalf of IREM Chapter 8 a big thank you to everybody for your participation. This was excellent. I think everybody took a lot out of this. Just as we're closing up, I want to again thank all of our sponsors this year, our title sponsor, Colliers International, as well as our event sponsors, Rupert, Landscape Tolly Electrical Corporation, and the RMR Group. As we're closing up. If anybody has any additional questions or inquiries about IREM itself, please visit irem.org, and there will be a wealth of information up there, as well as hopefully a recording of this video of this whole panel discussion. We will be doing this event again next year. This, as mentioned earlier, this is become a staple event for our organization, and you know, it keeps getting better and better every single year, and that's you know, huge aspect to our contributors. And Greg, certainly thank you again for joining us this year and moderating our event as you have every year for us. So we certainly appreciate all of your efforts. Without further ado, on behalf of Chapter 38 of IREM, we thank you all for your time today, and wish everybody a safe rest of your week, and look forward to seeing everybody again next year, hopefully in person. Thank you all.
Thank you.